The room went dead silent when she walked past the physician's lounge. Not because Sarah Chen made noise. She didn't. Her scrubs whispered against her legs with the kind of controlled movement that came from muscle memory, from moving through Helmand Province compounds at 0300 with weapons drawn and breathing synchronized. The silence came because Dr. Mercer stepped into the hallway and planted himself in her path like a man who'd never been told no by a nurse before. Sarah stopped 3 feet from him. Her hands hung at her sides, perfectly still. "Night shift again," Dr. Mercer said. His voice carried the particular cadence of a man accustomed to being listened to, Ivy League undergraduate, Harvard Medical School, chief of critical care for Cedar Creek Medical, Denver's premier trauma facility. His tie was Italian silk. His watch cost more than Sarah's rent. "You seem to spend quite a lot of time in room 12. Commander needs monitoring," Sarah said. 8 words. Flat. Even tone. "The commander is in a coma, Ms. Chen. His ICP is stable. His arterial blood gases are acceptable. There's no clinical reason for you to be spending your entire shift with one patient when we have 43 beds on this unit." Sarah didn't move. Didn't blink. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed their electric hymn, casting everything in that particular shade of white that made skin look like old paper. "Room 12 is assigned to me," she said. Dr. Mercer smiled. It was the smile of a man who'd already won an argument that hadn't started yet. "For now. We'll see how long that lasts." He walked past her, close enough that his shoulder could have brushed hers, but didn't. Sarah waited 15 seconds before moving. The waiting was its own kind of discipline. Cedar Creek Medical's ICU occupied the entire 3rd floor of the East Tower, 48 beds, cardiac monitors beeping in a chaotic symphony, ventilators wheezing their mechanical rhythm through the night. The day shift had just handed off at 1900 hours, and the hospital was already settling into that particular quiet that comes after the chaos of visiting hours, before the real crises arrive. Sarah moved through the unit like water around stone, acknowledging the night charge nurse with a nod, checking the supply station, confirming that the medications were stocked and the crash carts were sealed. Room 12 was at the far end of the unit, tucked into the corner where the hallway turned and the sounds from the main station became muffled by distance. Sarah stepped inside and closed the door behind her. The light from the hallway disappeared. Only the green glow of the cardiac monitor remained, casting everything in an underwater shade of emerald. The commander lay on his back, his broad chest rising and falling with the mechanical assistance of the ventilator, a maquette servo-eye with settings adjusted for low tidal volumes, protecting his lungs while his brain swelling decreased. His left arm lay across the bed rails, muscled and pale from 3 weeks of immobility, and there, at the bicep, just below the deltoid, the tattoo. Block letters. Faded blue-black. Angel Chen. Sarah's breath didn't change. Her hands remained steady. She'd served under Commander Marcus Holloway for 2 tours in Helmand Province. He'd been Force Recon, brilliant and ruthless, the kind of officer who'd march through hell and come out the other side smiling. They'd lost their medic in Sanjin Valley, a 19-year-old from Portland named Daniel Webb, and Sarah had wrapped his body in a flag while rounds snapped overhead, and Holloway had called her Angel after that because she'd gotten 3 wounded Marines out of a compound under suppressive fire while bleeding from a shrapnel wound herself. He'd had the tattoo done at a bazaar in Kandahar, that terrible needlework by a local tattoo artist who'd worked with a bottle of ink and a sewing needle, and he'd shown it to her with that crooked grin and said, "When I get old and tired, I want to remember what real courage looks like." Sarah had left active service 8 years ago. Holloway had extended his contract 5 times. She'd heard through the usual channels that he'd made commander, that he'd taken a desk job at the Pentagon, that he'd been recommended for a star. She'd never heard he'd ended up comatose in a Denver hospital. She pulled the chair to his bedside and Saturday. The seat was still warm from an earlier shift, and she placed her hand on his wrist, not checking his pulse. She could read that from the monitor, but touching him anyway. His skin was warm. His pulse was steady at 68 beats per minute, regular sinus rhythm, the kind of steady heartbeat that suggested his brain was still intact somewhere under the swelling that showed on the CT scans. "Hey," Commander," she whispered. Her voice was so low it barely disturbed the white noise of the ventilator. "It's Angel. I'm here for the night shift. Vitals are stable. Your ICP is down to 14 from 18 this morning. The neurosurgeons think you're going to wake up." His face didn't change. His eyes remained closed. The ventilator pushed oxygen into his lungs, and the monitor recorded every beat of his heart, every millimeter of pressure in his skull, every chemical shift in his blood gases. Nothing responded to her voice. Sarah held his wrist for 3 minutes, then released it and stood. She had 8 more hours on shift, 47 other patients to monitor, medications to draw and verify, charting to complete. She moved through room 12 with methodical efficiency, checking the central line for signs of infection, adjusting the rate on his tube feed, confirming that the Foley catheter was draining clear amber, that the tracheostomy was secure, that the oxygen saturation was holding at 99%. When she finished, she stopped at the door and looked back at him. "I'm going to find out who did this. I'm going to find out what happened. And when you wake up, you're going to help me." The hallway was empty when she stepped out. The night shift was in full routine now, nurses moving between rooms, respiratory therapists checking ventilator settings, the pharmacy intern restocking the med station. Sarah walked toward the stairwell and took it down 2 flights to the basement level where Cedar Creek kept the locked medication room. She used her access badge to get through the first door, then waited while the security camera cycled. The pharmacy was unmanned at 0200, the overnight tech was upstairs on the main floor, visible through the window, restocking supplies in the main storage area. Sarah moved to the medication log, the leather-bound journal where every narcotic dispensed from the locked room was recorded by hand, a DEA requirement, a double-check against the computerized system. She photographed 3 pages with the small camera hidden in the pen attached to her badge, a civilian camera with military-grade optics, the kind of equipment that would get her discharged from this hospital and arrested if anyone found it. But she wasn't a civilian. She was Captain Sarah Chen, assigned to Cedar Creek Medical under classified authority to investigate opioid diversion that fed money back to networks funding insurgent operations in Southeast Asia. The Navy's Office of Naval Intelligence had activated her for this assignment 8 weeks ago, and her cover was perfect, a retired Marine with nursing credentials, a quiet background, a complete lack of any visible military affiliation. She photographed the logs. She noted the discrepancies, fentanyl requisitions that didn't match the patient counts, morphine dispensed but not charted, hydrocodone quantities that fluctuated by 15% week to week. Someone was stealing. Someone with access. Someone who knew the system. She photographed for more pages, replaced the journal exactly where it had been, and walked out of the pharmacy as if she'd been doing nothing more than picking up the allergy medication for room 31's patient. The security camera had cycled away from the medication room window. No one had seen her. The night continued its quiet rhythm. Back in room 12 at 0230, Sarah sat again and held the commander's hand. His pulse remained steady. His brain waves continued their slow recovery. She had a photograph of his chart in her locker downstairs, along with a folded flag, gold stars marking 3 names, Danny Webb and 2 other names that she didn't speak aloud anymore. "I don't know why you're here," she whispered. "I don't know if this is connected to what I'm investigating or if it's just the universe being cruel. But I need you to wake up, Commander. I need you to remember. Someone's stealing medication. Someone's moving it. And when you wake up, you're going to tell me what happened, and we're going to trace it back." His monitor beeped steady. The ventilator wheezed its mechanical breath. Sarah remained there for another 8 minutes, her hands folded in her lap, her posture military straight, her face giving away nothing at all. The rest of the shift passed like every other night shift, blood draws at 0400, medication rounds at 0600, morning assessments before the day team arrived at 0700. Sarah moved through the unit like a ghost, competent and invisible, documented and unnoticed. When Dr. Mercer arrived for rounds at 0730, she was already in the supply room restocking the crash cart, her charting completed, her shift report prepared in bullet points that said nothing about classified investigations or tattoos or the weight of flags that cost lives. He didn't look at her when he passed the room. Thursday morning at 7:31, Dr. Mercer walked into the Grand Rounds conference room carrying a stack of patient charts, and Sarah Chen stood against the back wall in her scrubs, hands folded in front of her, waiting for rounds to begin like every other Thursday for the past 18 months. 12 residents sat in 2 rows. 4 attending physicians occupied the front table. The fluorescent lights hummed their usual sterile song overhead. Mercer set his briefcase down with the kind of careful precision that announced importance, and when he opened the first chart, Sarah already knew which one it would be. Her charting. Room 12. The commander's vitals from the previous night shift, her notes written in the clipped, clinical language she'd perfected over 2 decades of documentation, patient appears comfortable, repositioned for optimal ventilation, family contact attempted, neurological status unchanged, O2 saturation maintained at 94% on supplemental oxygen. This, Mercer said, holding the chart toward the residents, is what I call cowboy nursing. He didn't look at Sarah when he said it. He read her notes aloud in a voice pitched high and theatrical, sing-song cadence meant to trigger snickers, and snickers came from the second row like clockwork. Patient appears comfortable. He paused for effect, letting the sarcasm hang in the air like humidity before a thunderstorm. Does anyone here see an actual assessment? Comfort is not a clinical finding. Where's the Glasgow Coma Scale notation? Where's the pupillary response? Where's the intracranial pressure trend? He flipped another page, still performing. Or did Nurse Chen simply fluff pillows and call it critical care? Sarah's jaw tightened. Just barely. A muscle flexed beneath the skin and then stilled. But what can we expect? Mercer continued, his voice dropping into a confiding tone that was somehow worse than the mockery, from someone whose highest degree is an associate from a community college. Let's be clear about the difference between nursing school and actual medicine, residents. This is the difference. He held the chart up like evidence at trial. One of the attending physicians, Dr. Hayes, the cardiologist who'd once asked Sarah about her thoughts on the commander's arrhythmia pattern before Mercer entered the room, and suddenly the cardiologist stopped asking, looked down at the table. The residents kept their eyes forward, disciplined, understanding without being told that this was a lesson in hierarchy. In knowing your place. The room went exactly as silent as it needed to be for everyone to understand that Sarah's place was not in this room as anything but an audience to her own humiliation. She stood motionless for 17 seconds. Her hands remained folded. Her breathing stayed level. The kind of calm that comes from having already survived worse than public mockery, the kind of calm that comes from having held a wounded platoon leader's hand while waiting for medevac in 115-degree heat, knowing that whether the helicopter arrived in 8 minutes or 80 minutes, the outcome was already written. She simply watched Mercer finish his performance, watched the residents absorb the hierarchy lesson, watched Dr. Hayes refuse to meet her eyes. Then she turned and walked out of the conference room without her name being called again. 2 days later, Sarah stood at the third-floor vending machine during her lunch break, feeding dollar bills into the slot with mechanical precision. The machine ate her money twice before accepting it. She punched the code for black coffee. Mercer appeared as if summoned by the universe's cruelest choreography, walking down the hallway with 2 other physicians, Dr. Sterling from cardiothoracic and Dr. Bennett from neurology. The 3 of them stopped 15 feet away, close enough that Sarah could hear every word, far enough that she couldn't reasonably claim they were speaking to her directly. Which was, of course, the point. I'm honestly curious, Mercer said, his voice pitched to carry down the entire third-floor corridor. Does she even understand basic pharmacology? I had to correct her dopamine calculation yesterday. Twice. He let that sink in. Watched his colleagues' faces arrange themselves into expressions of concern, the subtle repositioning of status that happens when one doctor signals that another's competence is questionable. She calculated the drip rate at 30 milliliters per hour for a patient with hypertension. 30. For Commander Halloway. Sarah retrieved her coffee from the vending machine. The cup emerged with a mechanical thunk and she picked it up, her movement slow and deliberate, each action anatomically perfect. Retrieve cup. Release hand. Step away. The coffee was still steaming, the paper cup warm against her palm. She didn't turn around. She didn't respond. She simply walked back toward the ICU while Mercer continued his performance for his colleagues, explaining to them in careful detail how a nurse with only an associate's degree from a community institution could not be trusted with medication calculations, how it was honestly remarkable that patients survived her care at all, how they really needed to consider whether the hospital's credentialing standards had become dangerously lax. She made it to room 12 before the trembling started. And it wasn't fear. It was restraint, the kind that comes from knowing exactly what she could do to a man like Mercer if she let those 18 months of accumulated contempt off its leash. She could explain military discipline. She could explain what happens to officers who lose the respect of the people beneath them. She could explain, in clinical detail, every injury she could inflict with the forestand in the corner. Instead, she sat beside the commander's bed and drank her coffee slowly, letting the heat remind her that she was still capable of sensation, that she was still the woman who had closed wounds under fire in Helmand Province, that Mercer's voice was just noise, just the bureaucratic posturing of a man whose power existed entirely on paper and in the terrified compliance of residents who understood that contradicting him could cost them their careers. The commander's monitor beeped its steady rhythm. Sinus rhythm. 92 beats per minute. His chest rose and fell with the ventilator's assistance, the rhythm mechanical and perfect and utterly unconscious. She watched his face for any sign of recognition, the call sign whispered, the name spoken, and found nothing. Just a man in a coma, his brain slowly dimming, his neural pathways firing in patterns that meant nothing, led nowhere, woke nothing up. That afternoon, when Sarah checked her schedule posted in the staff break room, it had changed. Her assignment for Friday and Saturday, room 12, the complex cases, the patients who required assessment skills that Mercer had just publicly declared she didn't possess, had been reassigned to another nurse. Her name had been replaced with Jennifer Wu's. The schedule change was stamped with Mercer's initials and the date, all perfectly documented, all perfectly professional, all perfectly designed to remove her from the commander's bedside for 2 of the 7 days she had to find the evidence that would prove Mercer was diverting controlled substances from Cedar Creek's pharmacy. She found the counseling notice in her mailbox on the 3rd floor, unprofessional communication with physicians. Formal citation. To be placed in her personnel file. Signed by Mercer, dated that very day, with the timestamp showing it had been filed during grand rounds, while he was simultaneously reading her charting aloud in a mocking voice in front of 12 residents. The paperwork was immaculate. The language was precise. He wasn't yelling or threatening or engaging in anything crude enough to leave marks on someone else's career. He was simply documenting, systematizing, building a structure of institutional disapproval so carefully constructed that by the time he finished, it would be mathematically impossible to remove her without admitting the hospital itself had failed in its oversight. This was what true power looked like, not a raised voice but a raised bar, not a threat but a carefully orchestrated series of decisions that made her continued employment increasingly untenable. She sat in the break room for exactly 3 minutes, reading the notice again, understanding every word beneath the words, understanding the game's new rules. Then she folded it in half and placed it in her locker next to the folded flag from their fallen medic, the one she hadn't looked at since Afghanistan, the one that weighed heavier every year. That evening, during her night shift, Sarah found herself standing in the medication room at 11:47 p.m., ostensibly counting controlled substances for the shift inventory. The pharmaceutical safe stood open before her, rows of locked drawers containing fentanyl, morphine, Dilaudid, the precise compounds that her Marine intelligence briefing had identified as being diverted through Cedar Creek's supply chain into a black market that funded networks her country was actively fighting overseas. She'd been photographing the logs for 6 weeks, documenting discrepancies that matched the pattern, small diversions, clever timing, nothing obvious enough to trigger an automated alarm, just enough to disappear into the chaos of a hospital's daily operations. Dr. Mercer had accessed this room at 3:47 in the morning 4 days ago. No procedure scheduled. No emergency documented. Just one card swipe, 14 minutes of access, then gone. She'd checked the temperature logs. The refrigerated medication showed no temperature variance. Meaning nothing was removed from storage. Meaning he was there for something else, perhaps documenting his own work, perhaps confirming quantities, perhaps already planning his next move. The commander upstairs was the only person alive who'd seen the supplier's face. The only witness. And he was dying in room 12 by degrees, his brain activity dimming, his consciousness retreating deeper into whatever darkness comas contained. She had maybe 72 hours before his intracranial pressure became irreversible, before the neurological damage crystallized into permanent silence. But that night, she found something worse than the sound of the medication room door closing behind her. The fluorescent lights of Cedar Creek Medical's night shift hum their mechanical monotony while Sarah stands over the commander's bed, reading the numbers that tell her he's dying. Not today. Not tomorrow. But soon. The monitor displays a clock that only she can see, his intracranial pressure climbing 3 mm per hour, his brain swelling against the skull like water filling a sealed container. The baseline was 18 at noon. 21 by 8 p.m. 24 when she clocked in at 11. By her calculation, he has 72 hours before the pressure crosses the threshold where neural tissue begins to necrose, where consciousness becomes a mathematical impossibility. 72 hours to keep him breathing, to keep his body alive long enough for him to wake up, to recognize her voice, to say her name one last time. His pupils are already sluggish, responding to light the way a man responds to a question he doesn't want to answer. The right one lags behind the left by nearly half a second. Sarah documents it with the precision of someone trained to recognize the difference between stable and compromised, between sleeping and dying. The ventilator pushes oxygen into his lungs in mechanical rhythm, 12 breaths per minute, as if the machine has infinite patience. She doesn't. She's watched this deterioration before, in a mud-walled compound in Helmand Province during the monsoon, when the only equipment between death and another day of breathing was improvisation and hands that had stopped trembling years ago. But that was different. That was her job. This is the man who carried her? By the second night of her expanded observation, 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., 5 days straight because she'd picked up extra shifts and Mercer hadn't noticed or hadn't cared, Sarah sees the pattern in the pharmacy logs that she'd been photographing on her phone during her breaks. The metadata is encrypted, the access codes require biometric scanning, but the pattern is obvious to someone trained in supply chain interdiction. Mercer is pulling fentanyl vials in quantities that don't match patient census. 37 vials ordered on Tuesday. Patient records show 6 admissions requiring opioids. The math leaves 31 vials unaccounted for. On Wednesday, the order jumped to 42. By Friday, he's taken 53 vials out of the locked cabinet, and Sarah has photographs of every single transaction, the timestamp in the corner of each image, 2:24 a.m., 3:15 a.m., 4:33 a.m. The pattern shows a man moving through the medication room like someone accessing a secondary income source, moving like someone who knows the cameras rotate on a 12-second loop, moving like someone with nothing left to lose except access and plausible deniability. The thought of reporting it dissolves the moment it forms. She can't. Not yet. Not without revealing why a night shift nurse has surveillance training, why she's photographing controlled substances, why her phone contains secure Pentagon routing protocols that would classify her as federal intelligence the moment she produces them as evidence. She swallows the knowledge like swallowing something that tastes like copper and disappointment, catalogs it in the same mental compartment where she stores the names of the 3 men from her platoon whose faces she won't look at in mirrors. The commander's condition accelerates on the 3rd night. His oxygen saturation drops to 96% despite the ventilator pushing 40% FiO2 through his lungs. 94. The numbers are falling with the confidence of an elevator with a severed cable. Sarah studies the chest wall, watches for the rise and fall of breath, notices the asymmetry, the right side moving half an inch less than the left with each ventilator cycle. Her hands steady themselves. Everything inside her has learned to move slower when the stakes climb higher. She writes the observations in the chart with the meticulous documentation of someone who knows these notes will be read by lawyers if things go sideways. Right breath sounds decreased compared to left. Right chest wall expansion diminished approximately 50%. Possibility of pneumothorax developing. Recommend urgent physician evaluation. The timestamp reads 3:17 a.m. She pages Dr. Mercer. The callback takes 42 minutes. Nurse Chen. His voice carries the weight of exhaustion and the sharper edge of someone who resents being paged for what he assumes is a tremor in her hands, a moment of civilian anxiety misinterpreting normal variation as crisis. What's the issue? Room 12, Sarah says. The commander's right lung sounds are significantly diminished. His O2 is dropping despite increased ventilation settings. Physical exam suggests possible pneumothorax developing. Did you get a chest X-ray? Not yet. I wanted to alert you before. Then let's get a chest X-ray, Nurse Chen. That's how we do this. We get imaging. We use it to guide treatment. We don't speculate based on what you think you hear with a stethoscope that probably costs $50. The words land with the precision of a surgeon's blade, all the sharper for being delivered at 3 in the morning to a woman standing alone in an ICU with a dying man. Sarah's jaw tightens. She says nothing. The silence stretches across the phone line like a threat. I'll order the portable film, Mercer continues. In the meantime, boost the ventilator settings a bit. See if that helps. And Nurse Chen? If I find out you've been page bombing me for routine vital sign fluctuations, we're going to have another conversation with HR. I'm building a file. I'm documenting everything. Do you understand? She understands. She understands that there are battles that don't have front lines, that the most dangerous people aren't the ones who yell, they're the ones who document, who build cases, who weaponize institutions with the precision of someone using a hospital as a bunker. She hangs up without answering. The dial tone feels like punctuation on her career. The portable X-ray arrives at 4:12 a.m. Sarah watches the technician position the commander, watches his unconscious body bend and flex according to the requirements of the machine. The film prints out 12 minutes later, and she clips it to the light box above his bed. The image is grainy, the kind of picture taken at 3 in the morning by someone operating on muscle memory and indifference, but even the murkiness can't hide the fact that the right lung looks wrong. The density is off. There's a line where there shouldn't be a line, a shadow that speaks of air leaking into the space between the lung and the chest wall, pressure building, the body's own architecture becoming a weapon against itself. She pages Mercer again. Right pneumothorax visible on portable chest X-ray. Small but present. He needs intervention before it becomes tension pneumothorax. I'll call surgery, Mercer says. His voice has changed, hardened into something that sounds like someone defending a position. They can place a chest tube in the morning when he's stable and they have the full OR set up. For now, we monitor, we increase his oxygen, we let him compensate. That's not, Sarah starts. That's not what. Mercer interrupts. His tone drops into the register that makes residents flinch, that makes nurses rethink their decisions. That's not what you learned in your 12-week nursing program? That's not the standard of care according to a nurse who thinks she's a physician? Listen to me very carefully, because I'm only going to say this once. You are a floor nurse. You follow protocols. You document vital signs. You do not make treatment decisions. You do not call me in the middle of the night with your speculation about what might happen. And you certainly do not question my clinical judgment. The next time you page me for this patient, I will contact hospital security and have you removed from the ICU for insubordination. Are we clear? Sarah doesn't respond. She simply hangs up. The room is so quiet you could hear the ventilator's plastic tubing resonating with each mechanical breath. She looks at the commander's chest, at the way it started to move unevenly, the left side expanding normally while the right side lags behind like a motor losing synchronization. She knows what's coming. She's seen it before, when a young Marine from Sanjin Valley with a shrapnel wound developed the same asymmetry, the same slow suffocation as air accumulated in the pleural space without anywhere to go. They treated it with a ballpoint pen and a scalpel, and the sound of the rushing air escaping had been the most beautiful thing she'd heard in 3 months of combat operations. But this is Cedar Creek Medical in Denver, Colorado. There are protocols. There are committees. There are physicians with Ivy League credentials and committee appointments and the complete confidence of institutional authority. And there is a man whose eyes might never open again, whose last memory of her face might be from a day she can't remember, whose death would mean the loss of both a witness and a commander and a piece of her that she'd carefully packed away the day she stopped being Captain Sarah Chen and became just a nurse on the night shift in a hospital where the quiet people save lives and no one ever says thank you. His saturation drops to 89% by dawn. At 0300 hours, the monitor stops being a machine and becomes a voice screaming for help. Sarah is charting at the nursing station when the alarm pierces through the ICU's manufactured silence, not the gentle reminder of a drifting full line, but the sharp, staccato shriek that means oxygen saturation is dropping fast. She's on her feet before the second beep registers. Room 12. The commander. 75%. That's where his oxygen sits as she moves through the ICU doors with the kind of speed that doesn't look like rushing, economical, purposeful, the way someone moves when they've already triaged calculated 3 scenarios before the first breath. His chest is moving wrong. Not rising and falling symmetrically but pulling inward on the right side, the skin between his ribs retracting like he's being sucked into himself. The ventilator is pushing air in, but something is stopping it from coming back out. Tension pneumothorax. Collapsed lung. Pressure building in the pleural space, pushing against his heart, crushing blood vessels. Minutes until cardiac arrest. She knows this the way her hands know how to tie surgical knots, muscle memory, pattern recognition, the knowledge that lives in bone instead of textbooks. Another silence. Longer this time. Nurse Chen, you are a registered nurse. Not a physician. Not an emergency medicine specialist. Not anyone qualified to diagnose tension pneumothorax or recommend invasive procedures. You will step away from that patient immediately and maintain basic supportive care until I arrive. Is that clear? She watches the monitor. 68%. The commander's skin is taking on that grey undertone, the color of someone whose oxygen is leaving the building without permission. His lungs are raw from the intubation, his body already compromised by whatever put him in that bed in the first place. The minutes are draining faster than his oxygen. Yes, doctor. She hangs up and turns to the respiratory therapist, Marcus, standing beside the ventilator with the expression of someone watching a patient slip through their fingers. His hands are already moving, adjusting settings that won't matter if the pressure keeps building. She can see the calculation happening in his eyes, he knows what she knows. 62%. The crash cart is 3 steps away. The 14-gauge catheters are in the second drawer, sitting in sterile packages like a promise she's not supposed to keep. Every protocol in Cedar Creek Medical says she waits. Every piece of institutional architecture designed to protect doctors and hospitals and liability says stand down, let the expert arrive, documentation will protect you from blame. But the commander's oxygen is at 60% and dropping like a stone, and she can hear the breath he isn't taking, and she knows what dead sounds like in the space between one heartbeat and the next, and there is a man who once carried her through 2 kilometers of hostile territory with rounds snapping past his head, and his eyes are still closed because she hasn't saved his life yet. She moves. Not quickly. Not panicked. The kind of movement that looks like purpose, like authority, like someone who knows exactly what she's doing and has done it before on hot sand with mortar fire making the ground dance. She pulls the crash cart close and opens the drawer with the decisive snap of someone opening a door that everyone thought was locked. Hand me the betadine. Her voice isn't a request. It's a command, and Marcus doesn't question it. He's already turning, already grabbing the swab, already moving like he's been waiting for her permission to help instead of Mercer's prohibition against it. 58%. She preps the second intercostal space, midclavicular line, the space between the ribs where the needle goes in. The betadine smells like iodine and urgency. Her hands are steady. The tremor isn't fear, it's restraint, the kind that comes from having already survived the worst and knowing that the next 3 seconds will determine if this man wakes up or dies with his eyes closed. Nurse Chen, step away from that patient immediately. Mercer's voice comes from the ICU entrance, sharp and purple with rage. He's moving toward her, his hands raised like she's a suspect in a crime. "What are you doing?" "Step back." She doesn't step back. She doesn't acknowledge him. The needle goes in at the exact angle, the exact depth, the exact moment when his body is most likely to accept it. The catheter threads over the needle like silk and she advances it until the rush. The sound of pressurized air escaping, a hiss that sounds like relief, like survival, like pressure leaving the space where it was crushing bone. The sound of a life not ending. Mercer is shouting. "You just performed a surgical procedure. You're not licensed. That's practicing medicine without a license. I want security up here now." But the commander's oxygen is climbing. 62%. 71%. The color is coming back to his skin like someone's turning up the brightness on a photograph. 79%. His chest is moving symmetrically now, rising and falling the way lungs are supposed to, the ventilator actually getting somewhere instead of pushing against a pressure wall. 86%. The monitor stops screaming. Sarah stands there with the catheter taped in place and Mercer's voice exploding around her like the inside of a shell, and she turns to look at him with eyes like still water, completely calm, completely empty, the way someone looks when they've already accepted the consequences of saving a life. "His oxygen was 58%, she says quietly. 60 seconds more and his heart stops. "I'll wait in the break room for security." She walks past Dr. Mercer without another word, and she knows, the way you know lightning before you hear thunder, that this moment will cost her everything. By 0600, when the sun starts trying to break through Denver's November clouds, Mercer has built a documentation fortress. 3 separate incident reports filed with hospital administration, each one meticulously numbered with precise policy violations. Paragraph 1A, a violation of scope of practice, registered nurses may not perform invasive procedures. Paragraph 2B, insubordination and failure to follow direct physician orders. Paragraph 3C, practicing medicine without a license, a criminal offense with both civil and professional liability exposure. Each form is a masterpiece of bureaucratic precision. Each regulation is cited with its exact policy number from the hospital's compliance manual. Each sentence is carefully constructed to be legally unassailable, binding her termination in knots of institutional language so tight that even the best defense attorney would need surgical equipment to untangle it. He's filed them with risk management, with the nursing board, with quality assurance, with hospital legal. He's created a paper trail that reads like a confession, not his confession, but the evidence he's building that will prove, beyond any reasonable doubt, that Sarah Chen is dangerous. The worst part is that the commander is alive. Mercer will argue that she got lucky, that the diagnosis was coincidence, that a patient recovering from tension pneumothorax isn't validation of her judgment but proof of the hospital's luck in avoiding a catastrophe. He'll argue that she could have killed him. That she almost killed him. That the only reason she didn't is that the universe is generous to the reckless. And she can't defend herself. She can't say she learned to perform needle decompression under fire on the Helmand Province plain, because that would require explaining why a night shift nurse has combat medical training. She can't say she was trained as a force Recon medic before she was a captain, because that would require admitting her real identity, her real mission, the fact that she's been photographing Mercer's medication room access logs and documenting his suspicious fentanyl requisitions as part of a classified investigation into opioid diversion that reaches into networks the Pentagon is very concerned about. She can't defend her actions without burning her cover story, and burning her cover means the investigation ends, and if the investigation ends, the supplier network stays open, and the pipeline keeps flowing, and soldiers keep dying to fund cartels that Mercer is helping to supply. So she sits in the hospital administrator's office at 1,400 hours, and she doesn't say anything, and the administrator doesn't meet her eyes. "Your clinical judgment may have been sound," he says, and those words are the most expensive kindness she's ever heard. "But you violated multiple hospital policies." Dr. Mercer has documented a clear pattern of insubordination going back weeks. Challenging his decisions, questioning protocols, performing procedures outside your scope of practice. "We have no choice but to terminate your employment effective immediately." You're required to return your badge and any hospital property before you leave the building. She nods. She doesn't cry. She doesn't argue. She stands up and walks to her locker and packs a cardboard box with the artifacts of her life here, a cracked coffee mug with "World's Okayest Nurse" printed on it in fading letters, a dying succulent she forgot to water somewhere between shifts and secrets, and a photograph in a frame, her team in Helmand, 12 Marines standing in front of a dust-colored compound, 3 of their faces marked with small gold star stickers because they didn't come home. The folded flag from their medic is still in the side pocket of her locker, tucked against the metal like a secret waiting to be discovered. She runs her fingers across the triangle, the weight of it suddenly heavier than any medal, and she leaves it there because she can't carry everything at once. Walking to the bus stop in cold Denver rain that hammers like judgment, Sarah carries the cardboard box and the end of her investigation and the knowledge that the commander will die without waking because she's not there to stop it, and the supply network will keep flowing, and Mercer will keep diverting fentanyl, and nobody will ever know that the quiet night shift nurse was the only thing standing between the hospital and the darkness it was helping to create. The rain drowns the sound of her footsteps. The rain washes away the scent of antiseptic and coffee that lives in her scrubs. The rain is the only thing that hears her breathing when she sits down on the bus stop bench and sets the cardboard box beside her and watches the city move on without her. The rain keeps falling, hard enough to blur the bus stop shelter's plexiglass walls. Sarah sits on the bench with the cardboard box beside her, the cracked coffee mug visible through the top, the dying succulent, the photograph with 3 names crossed out in gold star marker. Her scrubs are soaked through. Her hands are perfectly still in her lap. She's thinking about how quickly a life burns down. 3 hours from saving someone's life to loading a box into her car. 3 hours from purpose to unemployment. The water running down the shelter's edge sounds like applause. Her phone buzzes. Unknown number. She almost doesn't answer. Captain Chen. The voice belongs to someone used to command. General level steady. This is General Harrow, Joint Special Operations Command. I need you to listen carefully. Don't speak. Just listen. She listens. Dr. Marcus Mercer has been flagged in your investigation for 2,400 micrograms of fentanyl diverted over 4 months. His access logs show patterns matching your documentation. What you did at 0300 this morning, the needle decompression, that was textbook Force Recon combat medicine. Mercer's complaint paperwork was filed at 0847. Exactly 42 minutes after the commander's vitals stabilized. I'm 3 minutes from Cedar Creek Medical with an escort team. Your employment termination is about to become irrelevant. The line goes dead. Sarah sits in the rain for 17 seconds, processing. Then she stands, leaves the cardboard box on the bench, and walks back toward Cedar Creek Medical at a pace that's either desperate or trained. The distinction stopped mattering about 12 years ago. 2 hours earlier, the administrator's office had smelled like leather desk chairs and expensive cologne that couldn't quite mask the acid sweat of a man making decisions that would haunt his email archive for years. He'd sat across from her with termination papers already signed, his hand shaking just enough to confirm he knew what he was doing was wrong. Captain Chen, the board reviewed Dr. Mercer's complaints, and the pattern of policy violations is extensive. 3 separate hospital protocols. Operating outside your scope of practice. Insubordination. The documentation is very thorough. Sarah had said nothing. Her composure had the quality of someone who'd watched better men die in worse circumstances. I have no choice, the administrator continued. You'll receive severance. 30 days. Your nursing license is in good standing, so other institutions. Sir, I understand. That was all. No defense. No explanation of classified assignment, combat medical training, surveillance protocols that made those medication logs look like a children's connect the dots puzzle. She couldn't defend herself without revealing why a night shift nurse had the steady hands of someone who'd closed wounds under fire. The classified assignment that brought her to Cedar Creek in the first place, investigating opioid diversion that potentially funded enemy networks, was worth more than her career. Worth more than the commander's life, apparently, in the institutional calculus of hospital policy. She'd stood, accepted the manila envelope, and walked out through corridors that suddenly felt 3 times longer. Cedar Creek Medical's main lobby at 10:45 on a Wednesday morning is full of people in motion, families visiting, insurance representatives, a cafeteria worker pushing a cart loaded with lunch trays. Then the glass doors burst open and a teenage boy storms through carrying a shadow box like it's a weapon. "I need the administrator. Now!" Marcus's voice carries across the entire lobby, young enough to crack with anger, old enough that people actually stop and listen. "My mother was fired for saving someone's life. For breaking policy to save someone's life. And you need to see why that's not okay." He opens the shadow box. The medals catch the fluorescent light like they're trying to announce themselves. Bronze Star. Silver Star. 2 purple hearts arranged like punctuation marks. And then, catching the light at an angle that makes the room go quiet, a Navy Cross hanging from its ribbon, the highest decoration a Marine could earn outside of the Medal of Honor. A crowd begins gathering. Phones appear. Someone gasps. A resident from the ER recognizes the significance and whispers to a colleague. The administrator emerges from his office, drawn by the commotion, his face draining of color as he realizes what those medals mean about the woman he just fired. Then a man in dress blues walks through the lobby entrance, Gunnery Sergeant Mitchell Kowalski, Marine escort for the commander, detailed to Cedar Creek for transport logistics. He's in his mid-50s with a jaw that looks like it was carved from concrete, and when he sees the medals in the shadow box, he stops moving entirely. "Wait," he says, and his voice has that quality that makes everybody listen without knowing why. "Wait. Those are Force Recon credentials. That's a Navy Cross. Where did you?" His eyes go to Marcus. Then they travel past Marcus to the edge of the crowd, where Sarah stands in her soaked scrubs, still wearing the same expression she's worn for the last 17 years, flat, measuring, the kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst. "Angel Chen." Gunnery Sergeant Kowalski comes to attention so fast it's almost violent. "You're the angel who carried the commander back through Sanjin Valley." Before anyone can answer, the lobby doors open again. This time it's not one person. It's a 2-star general in Class A uniform, flanked by 2 military police officers in combat boots that echo against the tile. Behind them, a woman in a charcoal suit with a DEA badge hanging from her neck. The general walks directly to the shadow box, and every movement he makes has the weight of institutional authority behind it. He reads the citation that came with the Navy Cross, the one that's been classified until this exact moment, the one that explains why a nurse working night shifts at a civilian hospital somehow has the kind of competence that makes doctors uncomfortable. For extraordinary heroism in Helmand Province, the general reads aloud, his voice carrying through the lobby like a command echoing off canyon walls, "Captain Sarah Chen, United States Marine Corps Force Recon, under sustained heavy fire, single-handedly stabilized for casualties including her commanding officer, then led their extraction through 2 kilometers of hostile territory while maintaining return fire, demonstrating exceptional combat medical proficiency and disregard for personal safety." He lowers the citation. Looks directly at the administrator whose hands are now shaking so violently he has to grip the administrator's desk for support. "Her classified assignment at Cedar Creek Medical had my personal authorization," the general says. "She's been here investigating opioid diversion connected to DOD intelligence priorities." Which brings us to Dr. Marcus Mercer, who has been flagged in her investigation for systematic fentanyl diversion. Specifically, 2,400 micrograms over 4 months. Specifically, time to supplier drops occurring on his scheduled medication room access windows. The DEA agent steps forward, badge gleaming like a promise. "Dr. Mercer, I need you to step away from the desk and place your hands where I can see them." Mercer. He's been standing in the back of the gathered crowd this whole time, watching his world collapse in real time. He's still wearing his white coat. He's still holding his hospital ID clipped to his pocket. The photograph shows him from 5 years ago, before his face learned how to show fear. "I'm the chief of critical care at this institution," he says, and his voice has developed a tremor that sounds like someone trying to hold a cup of water in an earthquake. "I have credentials, I have standing with the board, I have." "You have a supply van in the parking garage with false registration," the DEA agent interrupts, voice flat as a shovel blade. "You have deleted digital records of medication access logs. You have metadata showing you accessed those logs minutes after Captain Chen photographed discrepancies. And you have a documented pattern of filing false complaints against a subordinate immediately after she discovered your diversion pattern." The agent reads him his Miranda rights while recording phones capture every word. Mercer's face goes through a series of expressions that human beings usually only make in private: humiliation, rage, the specific flavor of terror that comes from realizing your entire shield of credentials and titles and Ivy League letterhead means nothing against the weight of actual evidence. Then Pete Kowalski, the hospital's IT specialist and Navy veteran, steps out of the crowd holding a hard drive like it's the most destructive thing in the room. "I archived everything before he could delete it," Pete says quietly. "Every frame of security footage from the medication room at 0400 this morning. His access logs going back 6 months. Metadata showing which files he edited and which he tried to destroy. The paper records from pharmacy audit backups that he didn't know existed because he never bothered to understand analog systems. He thought he was clever. He wasn't." Sarah stands motionless while the military police officers step forward and handcuff Dr. Mercer. His wrists go into the cuffs with a sound like chains, metal clicking against metal, the hiss of the ratchet tightening. The same hands that wrote dismissive notes about cowboy nursing and performed his bureaucratic precision attacks against her medical judgment are now joined at the wrists, rendered useless. "Dr. Marcus Mercer, you're being detained for questioning regarding the diversion of controlled substances, conspiracy to distribute, and obstruction of federal investigation," the DEA agent says, and there's something almost gentle in her voice, the gentleness of someone who's seen this before, watched institutional power crumble when it encounters actual authority. Mercer's lawyer would appear within hours. The federal charges would take months to adjudicate. But right now, in this moment, he's just a man in handcuffs being walked toward an unmarked sedan in the parking lot while his colleagues watch from inside the hospital, their phones recording his perp walk, his reputation burning in real time with the kind of public humiliation he'd tried so hard to inflict on her. Sarah watches him pass. Watches the DEA agent guide his head toward the sedan's door. Watches the moment his careful world, built on credentials and committees and the assumption that institutional power meant actual authority, collapses entirely. The gunnery sergeant approaches her slowly, comes to attention, and salutes the medals in the shadow box. Then he looks directly at Sarah with the kind of respect that doesn't need words. "The commander regained consciousness 20 minutes ago. He's asking for Angel." Sarah's composure finally fractures, not dramatically, not with trembling or visible emotion, but like a fault line forming, like something underneath suddenly giving way. Her eyes widen just slightly. Her breath catches. The cardboard box she'd set down on the bus stop bench 17 minutes ago suddenly feels less important than it did. Marcus grabs her hand. "Mom, go." Sarah runs for the elevator, Marcus and Gunnery Sergeant Kowalski following. Behind them, Dr. Mercer disappears into the sedan. His Ivy League credentials mean nothing now. His bureaucratic weapons have become ash. A resident who'd laughed during grand rounds turns away, unable to watch. The vending machine where he'd questioned her pharmacology knowledge stands witness to his absolute collapse. The elevator doors close on Sarah's face, still steady, still measured, but now carrying something underneath that wasn't there before, the possibility that the commander might still be salvageable, that the mission isn't finished, that some things worth protecting are worth breaking protocol for. Room 12 is 3 floors up. Commander James Harrison, Havoc 6, lies propped at 30 degrees with an oxygen cannula in place and his eyes open for the first time in 3 months. When he sees Sarah's face appear in his doorway, his cracked lips form the word Angel and tears start tracking down his weathered cheeks like rain on a windshield. She sets down the cardboard box and takes his hand. His grip is weak, damaged by 3 months of ICU sedation and muscle atrophy, but it's present. It's conscious. "Havoc 6, she says, her voice dropping into that register she reserves for people she's carried through hostile territory. "We've got you. Mission complete." He squeezes her fingers with what strength he has. "The supplier, base exchange. I remember the conversation. I remember the handoff location." The general enters quietly behind her, nods once, and signals to an intelligence officer who begins recording the commander's statement. Through the window, Sarah can see the parking lot where Dr. Mercer is being loaded into an unmarked vehicle, his entire world reduced to the space between the sedan door and his new reality. 6 months later, Sarah stands in Cedar Creek Medical's administrative wing wearing scrubs embroidered with Clinical Director, Emergency Services. Her military credentials have been integrated with her nursing license through a new DOD hospital liaison program. Marcus sits in the hallway doing homework, occasionally glancing up with undisguised pride. The commander visits monthly for outpatient therapy and never misses an opportunity to tell anyone who'll listen about the angel who carried him home twice. Dr. Mercer completes his court-mandated community service driving a medical supply van, delivering equipment to rural clinics in the Colorado hinterland. His framed diplomas gather dust in a storage unit. His reputation has been destroyed by the same documentation he'd weaponized against others. In the break room, Sarah pours coffee from a new mug reading "Trauma never leaves you, but neither does your team." She touches the folded flag from the fallen medic that now sits in her office, no longer hidden, no longer carried like a secret. A young resident approaches nervously. "I heard you were force Recon. Is that true?" Sarah looks at him with that same flat, measuring stare, the one that's been carved by 2 decades of absolute clarity about what matters and what doesn't. "The quietest person in the room might be holding it all together," she says, and walks past him toward the ER where sirens are already wailing their approach. Behind her, the resident stands a little straighter. Competence doesn't announce itself. It simply shows up and does the work. If stories like this inspire you, if you want to hear what happens when the people everyone overlooks turn out to be the ones carrying everything, please subscribe, like, and comment below. What would you have done in Sarah's position? Would you have broken protocol to save a life?